Okay, so thank you so much. So this is a synoptic report from Table 3, beginning with what are we able to do now in Arctic social sciences that we could not do 20 years ago. Our group began the conversation through discussing access to research fieldwork locations, having gone through a significant change in the past 20 years. So in some cases, access has become better, more common to have international teams, international collaboration. In some cases, logistics have also improved due to technological changes that we'll discuss further in Part B. That said, however, our group also took the time to reverse the question too, to ask what is not possible now that might have been more possible in the past, for example. So in terms of geopolitics, for example, some restrictions have increased. For example, the example of Russia was listed. As far as regionally based gatekeeping, for example. That means that some access has been limited, certainly not as easy as it was in the past. Licensing requirements and controlled access, etc. One aspect, too, that we looked at that has changed also is recognition. So for Arctic social sciences, funding and interdisciplinarity having become much more empowered. It's no longer viewed as strange to be looking at Arctic social sciences, whereas in the past, that may have raised some eyebrows. You know, who needs this? What is this supposed to be, for example? Whereas now that has been much improved as regards perhaps the overall respectability. Now, of course, with whole organizations dedicated to Arctic social sciences, etc. We wanted to look at Part B as well. So what results, discoveries, theories, methodological innovations, trends, and interdisciplinary approaches have changed the scope and place of Arctic social sciences? Community-driven research was extremely important. We looked at methodological innovations, such as communities identifying this as a need, being critically important, and a very, that's one of the most important aspects of a successful capacity building initiative. Has the community identified this as a need, not just what researchers are looking to instill in a community from the outside. We talked quite a bit about technological innovations that have changed in the past 20 years. I think that's a big understatement as far as what's possible technologically. Researchers incorporating GIS, even if the work is not entirely geographically focused. Mixed methodological approaches, coding using in vivo, looking at both the qualitative and the quantitative. I think that's a big one. Whereas in the past, it might have only been primarily quantitative. Now, certainly looking for those intersections between those theoretical approaches being viewed as relevant, whereas many of those might not have been possible or acceptable in the past. Video integration, right? Mobile application engagement, social media analysis of the Arctic, which is an area where I see real importance too. There's also the increased immediacy for dissemination of work, and the timeline for getting information back to communities can be dramatically accelerated through technology. We mentioned it too about data access in the north as being important, increasing bandwidth, important for that. We talked about communities identifying their own research protocols, IRB requirements changing, between different organizations, etc. Okay, let's see. We also looked to, in Part C, why do these changes matter to social sciences, the broader scientific community, and to society at large? One aspect that was mentioned was we're required to be much more upfront in terms of what broader impacts and useful products are. Community-based participatory research practices being extremely important. More people coming out of academic programs who are considered interdisciplinary than 20 years ago. There's a greater sophistication, our group elucidated further on how the theoretical focus and the analysis, we're expecting more, I think. In one moment it was said some of the basics have been covered and we're looking for more nuance, more subtlety, and more impact. Importance to be a properly trained social scientist at this juncture. Individuals and scientists who are more informed, know what's happened in the past in order to assist further with knowledge gathering and dissemination in the communities. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Melinda from Colorado State University. We talked about a number of different things that were similar to the previous table. That we are actually having this conversation here was one of the first things to come up, that we're speaking across silos in a way that we haven't previously, and so we have this opportunity to chat together. I think that many of the institutions still remain siloed So there has to be another avenue for how these discussions can move forward. There's more ownership from Indigenous communities in terms of setting the agenda. I think much is mentioned in the previous set of comments, so that we're not going to communities to say what we can do for you. They're setting the questions and they're saying this is what needs to be done, and if you want to come and help us, that's great. But if you don't, then hey, maybe we really don't need you. We are also seeing the recognition of and incorporation of the integration of Indigenous knowledge across many different of the research activities that we undertake. So maybe this is a form of decolonization that's happening before my very eyes. The technology certainly has changed and creates many different opportunities for us. I think it also creates other kinds of issues that we have to contend with, whether it's the technologists sort of driving those changes, and then how the disciplinary, how people within the discipline are able to respond to those changes. So again, technology driving things, who are the people that are driving in terms of that technology, and then who are the people in the disciplinary expertise, and is there a real connection between those? Increasing availability of data certainly is something for us to consider, and what is that data and how is it accessible? The use of cameras and images, being able to conduct participatory media research and considering what the ethics and are associated with those different kinds of things. Then let me scroll down here. We had a discussion about really talking about the bigger sort of meta issues about things, how feminism and postmodernism have really opened the doors for us to understand the role of Indigenous knowledge within the larger schema of how we understand what's going on in the landscape today. And this has been, I think this is kind of profound for us to think about that for a moment, what that contribution is. And also how to think about the role of the relationship between science and these different communities that we're working with. What is traditional ecological knowledge? What is science? Talking about those bigger questions and how we can understand the leadership of research within these Indigenous communities. So some of the, I guess, results that we came up with at the end of the day, we see more inclusive theoretical approaches, but maybe not a deep dive into the specific methods that we're looking at. So we may be talking about that we have different methodologies out there, but what specifically are the methods we're using, and how might we further discuss those? Are we doing hypothesis-driven research, or are we looking at research questions? Again, that's a tension, I think, within our different approaches to these things. What is the science of climate change, and how do we consider inductive versus deductive methods? Looking at the role of entrepreneurship and how that is situated within the larger discussion of economic development, of capitalism, how we understand these terms, and how we look at livelihoods as associated with understanding what is valuable, where do values come from, and how do values then drive that entrepreneurship, and how does that change up the stage on which we're working. And finally, how are the measures and metrics that we're using not shifting or not in sync with each other, especially measures of livelihood, wealth, satisfaction, sustainability. And the last question, right as we were interrupted, was, what is the purpose of Arctic social science? I'll leave that for the next table.
The purpose of Arctic social science is to have meetings like this so we can convince ourselves continuously that we're all still relevant. We talked about a number of different topics, one of which is the ability to do big science that we couldn't do 20 years ago. Now, it's not just a matter of the computing power, which we all have today, that we could have never imagined in the mid-1990s, but also the data sets, the ability to do longitudinal studies. And we talked how that's created oftentimes in many communities, interview fatigue or survey fatigue. And we all know informants that have taken 30 questionnaires in the last 30 years. Okay, we all know this. We all know who they are. They've talked to us about it and said, I filled the same form out, 3 years ago. But at the same time, if those data were available, we could do longitudinal studies that could have never been done prior to the development of a more formalized Arctic social science program in the 1990s. Could have never been done. and along with the computing power to do such things. That brings us also to the whole idea of being able to do the kinds of social network studies that we're all interested in, even Fourier transforms analyses, and all kinds of things that we would not have been able to do because of a lack of computing power. We talked quite extensively about data and interdisciplinary and how that might work for us, and some frustration of the early days of interdisciplinary analysis where everybody went off and did their own thing, all the different disciplines, got together once a year to share data, and nothing really fit together. They go, oh yeah, that's kind of like, that goes with mine, or that goes with mine. To what we hope to do today, where we have large interdisciplinary hypotheses, and every subdiscipline or every discipline knows exactly what data they have to collect to answer that hypothesis or question, or however you want to make it work. And maybe that's our transition from interdisciplinarity to transdisciplinary, or even a lack of disciplinary. Maybe it's the research question might drive it. We also talked about access in relation to citizen science, to some extent community involvement, and of course we all recognize the importance of community involvement in the generation of scientific interest, the generation of questions, the participation of communities in the generation of the kind of data that we're interested in. But we really haven't gone the next step, which is happening in many disciplines around the world, is the whole idea of actually crowdsourcing some of the data that we're interested in. We talked about the ability now to do interviews over Skype, and we all know anthropologists that follow up at least their initial interviews using Skype and keep in constant contact. And there's even IRBs generating Skype-based consent forms now. And so there's a whole bunch of interesting things we can do along those lines that we didn't have access to. I, for one, and many of the rest of us in the 1990s, were writing entire NSF proposals to create a GIS of a particular region, hiring 3 or 4 students to digitize all the maps, bring in all the aerial photos, and register them all, going out into the field and trying to register these maps. And now, of course, it's all done. It's just a matter of incorporating your own data. You can even do it in Google Maps. And so there's a really major transformation in our ability to do large-scale or even small-scale spatial analysis that's occurred in the last 20 years. When it comes to theoretical kinds of issues, one of the big problems of getting more cultural anthropology into Arctic social sciences in the early 1990s was most of social sciences, especially geography and anthropology and others, were stuck in that kind of post-Bourdieuian, postmodern, French post-structuralist, post neo-Marxist ideal that everything was individual, science was inhumane. If you put anybody in a table, it couldn't be published in American Anthropologist because tables dehumanize humanity. At least we got over that, right? And if people wanted to get funded, they had to get over it. And they got over it really fast. It's amazing what $1 million will do to your theoretical perspective. But it's been a big transition in the history of social sciences, and largely driven in the Arctic by the Arctic Social Sciences Program and the requirement that things have bigger implications than the individual, even sometimes bigger than the community or the region. And that's been a fascinating shift for many of us to watch. Conceptually, we've learned one important thing. We made a transition from the 90s to today from a mindset that the Arctic had been static, and the new dynamics of global warming and global change were impacting that preconceived notion of this landscape in the Arctic. And now we're taking it from day one. We have a really dynamic Arctic. It's always been really dynamic, and now we have a new dynamic that we have to deal with, and it's requiring different kinds of solutions. But there's no preconceived notion that now we're just dealing with human impacts. We've got 10,000 years of human impacts, 10,000 years of climate impacts, 10,000 years of other kinds of impacts, and we're looking at it in that sense that we have this very dynamic worldview. And I guess one of the most important things, the changes that matter to social sciences, big in some significance, I think it was mentioned just previously as well, is we're relevant for the first time. We have some relevance, and our information is accessible. And this goes along, Mike just brought this up to me and pointed it out, but it's very similar to this project I've been working on called the democratization of science, is that our data are not just relevant to ourselves, to our publications, but there's actually indigenous peoples, local villages, fisheries groups, sea mammal groups, hunters, who are taking our data and using it for their own self-interest. And they're taking our data offline out of our publications, and they're going out and saying, look, this anthropologist said this and this and this. We can use this to get access to more seals, or access to a particular species of bird, or access to particular landscapes. And so the kind of democratization of science, the democratization of data use, going beyond the academic community to local peoples, youth, politicians, economists, and certainly people that might not use it the way we'd want them to, but it's all there and it's all available. And I hope I caught everything that our table talked about. Did I miss anything? No? We're good? Okay. Thank you.
So I'm Heather Gordon, and I am a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we did not talk about quite as much as the last group, and the other groups have kind of covered some things we've talked about as well. So I'll touch on some things, and if I come across some things that we expanded on, I'll expand a bit. So we started out talking about technology, and we touched on Skype and Instagram, and we talked about how different apps are being developed in different languages, and how much this has extended our communication. We also have a lot of more horizontal connections between scientists due to globalization. And, the internet, cell phones, this is all helping us as well. And even the discourse itself has changed with new technology and methodologies and the incorporation of indigenous knowledge. And people are actually, I'm on the 20-year thing, people are paying more attention to indigenous knowledge. And there's more of an emphasis on youth than there was before. And then I wasn't entirely sure if there was much on food security before, but I know food security is very important now. So we decided there was more cross-discipline work, and that due to changes in politics and interests that has, as someone else said, increased funding and the relevance of the field. So the next one, working with the next one, we found the same working with communities, not in them, has been very important, and also archiving data and trying to make it more accessible, producing results that are practical. But we found a challenge in all of this, and this technology and this data, in that we get data so quickly now, and we're able to get so much of it so fast that then we need time to process it. So we need to keep moving with our technology to newer ways to process and analyze data, since we're getting it in such large quantities so fast. Indigenous methodologies are being considered more often now, and indigenous people are even being turned to for answers and for the knowledge that they have. And so we talked about how we're moving from exploratory research to we're moving towards using exploratory research to spend time in the community to try and avoid helicopter research practices. Through this, researchers are going much deeper and building relationships, and through that, getting more knowledge from the project and more data than before. We also talked about the change in DNA collection, how it was not really so invited about 20 years ago, but now, due to the questions being relevant to the community themselves, there's becoming some indigenous DNA collection for sure in Arctic Alaska. So how does this do question 3? So we decided that sometimes this does empower communities, and we liked that, and that researchers are getting more data by building more relationships, and they're having a more holistic view of knowledge. The more archiving we do, the more data accessibility, so that scientists can learn from each other, expanding knowledge and amplifying through exchange of knowledge, so they're not reinventing the wheel. And we have a linguist in our group and other language speaker, and we were talking about that projects are written up in different languages, and maybe they're written up in Russian and they're written up in English, and who is expected to learn the other language so that they can learn about the other project? And should all of one be translated to the language of the other? So how do we cross that divide to get access to data? We also thought the government and policymakers are becoming more interested in scientific products and in indigenous knowledge, and that they're becoming more informed. And then in total, we thought that change has seemed to be generally positive over the last 20 years. So, thank you.
All right, I'm back again. Peter Pulsfer from the University of Colorado. So our group had some interesting discussions, and I think we have a lot of connections and overlap, if you will, with the other groups, but I'll go through a summary of what we talked about. So one of the big changes we've seen in the last 20 years, of course, is larger, more complex international work based on better levels of funding and organization. So we heard a bit about groups like IASA and IASC, Social and Human Working Group, from Peter this morning. So those did not exist, but now they're well-developed organizations that can really promote that sort of interaction. And I think it's really interesting to note that a social scientist is now the president of the International Arctic Science Committee, Susan Barr. So that's something I would guess 20 years ago nobody would have predicted, even in a short 2 decades. Interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary was really a big part of our discussion, better connections between the social sciences and physical sciences, and of course the better connections, although there's still a lot of work to do with indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge. A lot of discussion about technologies. So we talked about how technology is making some field methods easier, cheaper, smaller, so you don't have to carry your tape recorder and a suitcase full of tapes to go, do some of the work that you might be doing. But of course, it's also making, all of those things are more accessible within communities by community members. They're able to actually be active sort of participants and or designers and drivers of the research. Discussions as well about things like data integration, big data, data science, being able to analyze social media, crowdsourcing, and that sort of thing. Some other things that we think have come about in the last 20 years that have facilitated new ways of working are things like mechanisms for transparency and accountability. And again, these are still evolving, but we now have things like in Canada, there's a system where work in communities requires a license. You can't just walk in and say, "Hi, I'm here. Aren't you lucky and aren't you happy about that?" It's okay. We have to actually propose the research, and communities can, and I know from experience, do reject some projects and say we're not interested in that for whatever reason. We have things like the Ottawa Traditional Knowledge Principles that came out a couple of years ago, which sort of formalizes the expectations around interactions. So in terms of results, we actually talked a bit about what we thought were some notable results over the last 20 years related to social sciences. So things like the Arctic Human Development Report, there's actually 2 of them at this stage. The Earth is Faster Now, the book that's being distributed. Arctic Climate Impact Assessment has an important social science component. In 2005, the IASC ICARP 3 process included social sciences, and really important, I think, the International Polar Year. So for the first time, social sciences were included in the International Polar Year, and I think made a huge impact. They were some of the most successful projects and some of the highest, most notable projects of the whole IPY were social science projects. So that was big. IPCC was mentioned as well. So those are just some, I think, tangible sort of outcomes that we see. On the theoretical side, we have many new tools, although imperfect in some cases, but things like complex systems theory, space-time interactions, social ecological systems, or SES, as a unit of analysis. Post-colonial and feminist theories, it's come up before. Climate change science, including social systems now. It's not strictly a physical sort of science perspective. Sustainability science. The recognition for the need of quantitative and qualitative, and not just assuming that qualitative can be translated or reduced into quantitative. So I think that a lot has happened in the last couple of decades there, and then of course Indigenous science and local knowledge as well. On the methodological side, qualitative methodologies have really advanced, and in some cases I think, Arctic scientists are making great contributions to that because of the complex topics that we're dealing with. Mixed methods, of course, and I know participatory action research is really evolved. And we talked a lot about technology as well, data collection, representation, preservation, use, and so on. Went into greater detail than that. But in terms of trends, the changing relationships with Indigenous peoples and Southern-based science, I think, is a trend that we're seeing, and it's moving and moving rapidly. Interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, storytelling, all kinds of other types of movements. A movement, and I think is quite recent, which is this idea of clusters within and between research centers. So you're seeing universities like this university creating, focused Arctic science centers that include or are based on social science approaches, and also these various networks that are forming. So I think that's been an interesting trend. More gender balance, and I think Andre's term was feminization of human capital, so looking at those changes over time. And also a trend that we're seeing again more locally, rediscovery of cities and urban areas, which is probably over the last 5 years or so. Why do they matter? People talked about recognition, so it matters to social scientists because all of this work is culminating in society, funders, et cetera, saying this is important. Much larger theoretical and methodological toolkit now, so people have more to work with so they can get better results and also tackle new questions. And then, of course, the whole technology component. There's all kinds of aspects to that. Broader scientific community, why is it important to the broader scientific community? Just that a lot of what we're doing, we're on the cutting edge of it, and I think that's certainly true in certain areas of theory and methodology, the participatory that I mentioned, which is relevant, and I know the group that we work with, we're now being approached by people who are working in mid-latitude saying, can you come help us because you're actually doing work that we would like to do. So that's sort of interesting. I think we are globally relevant. And then finally, to society, we thought some of the work that's being done are sort of resulting in things like adaptation frameworks and engagement processes with communities and with governments, bringing capacity closer to the ground, and then informing policy making. That, we realize, again, is not where it probably needs to be, but at least we're starting to have these conversations and we're starting to get this sort of engagement. So that summarizes what our group talked about.
So I think we're the last group, and we'll just make a few additional comments to all the excellent comments that have already been made. My name is Bob Ortung, and I'm at George Washington University. So in terms of changes in Arctic social sciences, we also noticed the increasing access to places like Russia, and then, of course, the closing of that access over time. And then, of course, the increasing access to information through things like e-libraries and things like that. Like the other groups, we noticed the big interest and accessibility of all the new technology. And so, for example, with Facebook, you can really track movements of people in the Arctic. A lot of Russian social scientists have been tracking Facebook and other kinds of social media profiles to see, especially young people, of course, who were born in the Arctic, where they've been moving. You can trace their movements around and, out of the Arctic, back into the Arctic, and where they're going and how they stay connected. It's very interesting. Also, using Twitter, you can look at things like poverty maps of cities, finding out what people are talking about over time and different parts of the city and what matters to them. Let's see. A lot of people have been noticing the use of mobile apps so that you can have a lot of citizen scientists taking pictures of what's happening in their region and reporting that back into larger databases. And of course, the new technologies like Map My City, where you can use students to do a lot of digital mapping. Unlike some of the other groups, though, we noticed some of the negative results of this increase in the kinds of data and the kinds of technology. And so One group member pointed out that, for example, the U.S. Census is not collecting the kind of social and economic data on a consistent, regular basis the way it did in the past. So we're losing the kind of some of that census data that we had. Another problem, of course, is that we have all this new data, but there's large questions about how reliable this data is, what it's really telling us, how we can manipulate it, how we can apply it to some of the basic research questions that we really want to ask. And so that puts a big burden on people to try and figure out what to do with all this new social media data, for example. And of course, there's a lot of innovative solutions like using mixed methods, so you can take the social data that you get and then try and go and interview people and use some of the more traditional techniques. So that's creating a lot of new challenges in the field. In terms of the second question, the results, discoveries, theories, and how that affects what we know, and I think the archaeologists in our group, which seemed to be the majority, seem to have benefited the most from all this technological innovation and applying. And they don't just go dig holes and dig up bones anymore. And there's lots of more fancy things they can do. And why that's relevant is, what to me as a political scientist is very interesting, is that now you can go back and understand, not just when a society collapsed, but you can start looking at what they were doing to prevent that collapse, what kind of things they were doing in terms of sustainability, resilience. And so the main insight you get from all this is that even though the world is changing today, the world's been changing for a long time, and human society has dealt with this kind of climate change and changing conditions. And so we can learn a lot using this new technology and going back and looking at time and seeing how previous societies dealt with these changes. So that's very uplifting. In my own field of political science, everything has become quantified lately. And so that's good, because now you can measure what it is you're talking about and demonstrate it with very methodologically rigorous analysis. On the other hand, it limits what you can talk about to something that you can quantify. So that means those guys studying voting patterns in Congress dominate the field, and the rest of us who want to talk about less quantifiable things, leadership and why people do what they do, it makes it much more difficult to get published in a political science journal, because it's hard to quantify that kind of stuff, although it's still interesting. Let's see. So data management is also a big change, and it's very important that many journals now require people to publish their data in order to get their articles published, and that, of course, raises a lot of questions I think we'll discuss tomorrow. So that's really useful too. So why is this all important? So for the social sciences, it matters because it's helped to broaden our interpretive ability and data generation, and we can build up new methods and new techniques. For the broader scientific community, it changes the kind of research questions we can ask. So you can look at the interaction between the natural sciences and the social sciences, which is very important. And finally, for society at large, I think we agree with many of the points that have been made. One point I think that deserves real emphasis is that we need to improve our ability to communicate our scientific findings to the broader population, to voters particularly, and to politicians, so that they can understand what it is, why we're excited about what we're doing and why it really matters. And so that puts a big emphasis on the need for better visualizations, better infographics, some of the things that you don't always think about, but better ways of communicating what it is you do and why it's important. So leave it at that.
Actually should have maybe asked, well, because we always wanted to go and get lunch, but I mean, if there are any other thoughts, we could also, and I understand that not everything has been covered by groups, so if within the groups there are people who want to add something, that's of course not restricted, or if you want to add something right now, that will be fine as well. I think we need to make sure that it's not just the reporter is the only voice. So if you have anything that you feel that was not reflected and you think it's important, speak up now. Yes, I'll have to give you the microphone.
I just have a follow-up comment about youth as being an important arena in which to discuss things. And one is, I think, the hope that youth brings for the future. and the fact that I think with respect to figuring out problems and adapting to technology, I think youth are fearless, and they just have an ability to figure out technology in new and unusual ways that are going to be part of this future trajectory for how we try to solve problems in this area.
That's all very true. Shauna. Yeah, I have to announce your name, or you have to tell, because Anna doesn't see you there.
Shauna. Hi, Anna. So our group also mentioned, in the context of theoretical changes, I wanted to mention repeat, so vulnerability, resilience, complex adaptive systems. Those are terms and terminologies that come from the natural sciences and that have been adopted in different ways, shapes, and forms by social scientists in varying degrees. And I don't want to give the sense that this has been non-conflictive. There's actually been very strong pushback from within the social sciences against resilience, for example, and in the context that it's too positivistic and it ignores issues of gender and power and equity. And so this give and take between kind of an adoption of a concept and a pushback and then kind of an iterative change in the way that it's used and applied and sometimes pushed away from and engaged with is a really fruitful area of theoretical discussion that oftentimes happens within these collaborative and interdisciplinary groups. Oh, and I also wanted to mention agent-based modeling. So modeling.
Modeling what?
Agent-based modeling. Modeling is also a tool. It exists now, and it probably will grow.
You want to say something? Yeah, well, actually, yeah, we didn't really talk about models at all in this, and it's agent-based, but there are other, of course, models that have been advanced, whether, with geospatial technology or economic, rightly, and other things. Okay, any other general comments and observations for this subject? If not, then we move to the next one. So next set of questions, and we have a break, of course. See, I put a lot of breaks so people could enjoy being here as opposed to being, feeling like horses in some kind of race. So, but our next set of questions actually deal with relevance, broader impacts of Arctic social sciences. So, we can, go for a break and reconvene at our allocated time, which is 2:50. So you have 20 minutes break. Thank you very much, and make sure that you switch your tables.